I married the coldest millionaire, but I never expected what happened next. I never planned on marrying a man like Alexander Vale. I always imagined I would fall for a teacher with chalk on his sleeves, or a musician who smelled like espresso and old books. Instead, I walked straight into a winter storm dressed as a man, tall and polished, eyes like blue glass that never fogged. He did not flirt. He observed. He did not chase. He decided. And in the space between his quiet and my curiosity, something started to glow. We met at a gallery opening in the city. My friend dragged me there after work, promising live music and free wine. I was staring at a photograph of a woman standing in the sea at night when he stepped beside me, hands in his pockets, immaculate suit, polished shoes, a silver watch that caught the light like a tiny moon. He said the woman looked like she was defending a secret. I said maybe she was choosing it. He turned to me then, as if I had surprised him, and smiled in a way that made the rest of the room blur. People whispered his name that night. Vale, the investor with the impossible penthouse. Vale, the man who never stayed long. I did not care. He listened to me talk about my job and the charity art classes I ran on weekends. When he asked if I would have dinner with him, his voice was calm, not hungry, not eager. It felt like stepping into a quiet library and finding a chair already warm. It was never a whirlwind by speed. It was a whirlwind by gravity. He learned the shape of my days. He sent flowers to my office on Wednesdays, always wildflowers, always a note that read the same thing every time. For your middle of the week. He tasted like mint and restraint. He never pushed for more than I offered, and I mistook that for kindness. The truth is that distance can feel like respect when you want to believe. Winter folded into spring. He took me to restaurants where the napkins were heavy and the servers knew his drink, but my favorite nights were the quiet ones in my small apartment. He would loosen his tie, sit on my floor, and let me paint his knuckles in watercolor as a joke. The paint dried in thin blue maps, and he would look at his hands as if they belonged to someone who was almost free. He kept asking about my family, my friends, the stories that made me. He was curious about me and somehow never available for questions about himself. When I asked, he kept it gentle. He had grown up with a father who taught him that feelings were currency, and you do not spend what you cannot replace. The proposal happened on a Tuesday. No glitter, no crowd. He picked me up after my class, still in my paint shirt, hair pulled back, paint on my fingers. We drove along the river where the city made room for water and the sky. Parked. Walked down to the dock where the lights trembled in the current. He stood behind me and slipped his palm around mine. No speech. Only a small box in his other hand, opened like something that had been waiting months to breathe. The ring was simple and bright. He said my full name like a vow and asked me to build a life with him. My yes felt like a door clicking into place. People tell you that love is warmth. Sometimes love is an ice rink under sunshine. It looks safe until you hear the distant sound of a crack. Still, our wedding day was a beautiful blur. White peonies. A string quartet. His hand steady against my back. He kissed me with the focus of a man giving exact change. The photos looked like a dream. We smiled the way people smile when they meet the version of themselves they want to keep forever. The reception ended with a flurry of confetti that sparkled like soft rain. He leaned in close as we left and told me he would spend the rest of his life making sure I never doubted his choice. The mansion waited on a hill past the city, a place with tall windows and long corridors that carried your footsteps forward like a secret. I had never lived in a house where the walls breathed with the lives of so many people. A gardener who spoke to roses as if they were shy. A chef who placed breakfast on the table like an arrangement. A housekeeper named Clara who had the softest eyes and a way of walking like she already knew the rhythm of every room. They were kind and professional, and I was the new queen in a palace I did not know how to rule. On our first night there, he gave me a tour as if it were an art exhibit. He named rooms the way curators introduce pieces. The library with ceilings high enough to hold storms. The winter garden with glass panes that laced the moon into diamonds. His office at the end of the west corridor, door heavy, lock shining. He did not pause there for long. He only said, "This is where I keep the board and the filings," and then he moved on with the grace of a man who could cross a tightrope without looking down. We settled into a rhythm quickly. Breakfast together when he could. Black coffee for him. Earl Grey for me. He kissed my temple, checked his watch, and disappeared into a day filled with meetings that had no names. I tried to make the house mine. I painted in the morning light that pooled on the east terrace. I explored the cabinets and found a collection of linen napkins embroidered with initials that were not mine. He insisted they belonged to his grandmother. I believed him because believing is an act of love. At night, the house changed. It grew quiet in a way that was not rest. It felt like a lake without wind. His office door would stay closed, the light under it thin and constant. He would emerge late, kiss my hair, and tell me he was almost done with a deal that demanded everything. I told myself the cold was temporary, a season, a price you pay for a future with fewer worries. I told myself the warmth would come later and last longer. Friends asked if I was happy. I said yes. My yes was careful. Love is not performative, but marriage is made of small performances. The good morning voice. The dinner smile. The gentle reaching for a hand that sometimes did not reach back. He bought me a car I did not need. He sent me dresses I would wear only once. I asked him to take a walk with me in the park without security. He said soon and kissed my forehead again, precise as a stamp. Weeks passed and turned into a season. One evening, I found a journal while unpacking a final box for my apartment. I had not written in it for months. I opened to a blank page and wrote a line the way people breathe through their teeth when they are cold. I married a man who feels like January. It did not hurt to write it. It also did not help. Clara began to leave small things for me to find. Fresh lavender bundles tied with twine in the linen closet. A book of poems with a folded corner on a page about faithful winters. She would catch my eye sometimes and offer a smile too gentle to be pity. She had worked in the house long before me. She knew the way the air changed in different rooms. She seemed to know the history trapped behind the heavy doors. When I asked about Mr. Vale, she said he was generous and demanding and a man of his word. Then she added that he was a man who had learned to lock rooms for a reason. One night, lightning stitched the edges of the sky and rain hit the glass roof of the winter garden so hard it sounded like 1,000 small hands. I could not sleep. I walked the corridor barefoot and stopped outside his office. The light had been on for hours. I pressed my palm to the wood and felt nothing. Not heat. Not the hum of a voice. Only the cold of a door that knew how to wait. I turned away and returned to bed. When he slid in beside me later, he smelled like mint and night air. He pulled me close, not tight, not loose, as if measuring the exact distance that would keep us both from falling. In the morning, he suggested a weekend by the sea. I wanted to say yes, so I did. We drove with the windows down and the radio low. On the shore, he held my hand and looked out at the water like a man reading a map he could not share. We ate oysters and laughed at a dog chasing foam. For a few hours, he was warm. Then evening came and his phone lit up with a name I did not see, and he stepped away to answer. He spoke in that tone he used for investors, or so I told myself. When he returned, he wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and asked if I was cold. I said only a little and let the lie rest in my mouth like a stone. I told myself every marriage has edges, that ours would soften with time, that I simply needed more keys, that I simply needed to be patient. I wrote in my journal again that night, one line that felt like a promise I was making to a version of me who had not learned yet. I will not mistake silence for safety. The next morning, back at the mansion, I passed the open door of the library and froze. On the table sat a red envelope, thin and magnetic. The name on it was written in a script I did not know. Isabella. My pulse skipped in a way that made the world go grainy. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. He stood in the doorway, immaculate and unreadable, eyes like blue glass that had never known steam. He picked up the envelope and slid it into his jacket with a small nod, as if we both understood its place in the day. He kissed my cheek, told me he would be late, and left a drift of mint in the air. I watched the front door close and did not move. Above me, the chandelier hummed. Outside, the gardener spoke to the roses in a language of water and light. Inside, the house waited, long corridors stretching toward a west wing where a door would soon mean more than a door. I stood there, not cold, not warm, poised at the edge of a winter that was only getting started. The morning after the red envelope, the mansion felt different. It was as if the walls had swallowed something during the night and were now keeping it safe, hidden, far away from me. I went about my routine anyway, the way you do when you are pretending you did not see what you saw. Breakfast with the sunlight pouring in through the tall windows. My tea steaming. His coffee untouched on the table because he had already left before the toast was even golden. The air in the mansion was always cool, even in the sunlit rooms. At first, I thought it was the air conditioning, but I started to believe it was the house itself. It had been built with cold bones, stone and marble that refused to warm. My footsteps echoed in the corridors. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, I would stop and realize I had not heard another human voice for hours. Even the staff moved like shadows here, appearing only when needed, disappearing just as quickly. Clara was the only one who ever lingered. She brought me fresh linens, asked about my sleep, placed vases of pale lilies in my bedroom without asking. She seemed to know when my mind was too full. She never pried, but her glances lasted a beat longer when she caught me staring toward the west wing, where his office door stayed closed. I tried to fill the days. I wandered through the library, running my fingers over rows of books with spines that cracked like old leather. I painted in the winter garden, the glass panels above filtering the light until it looked like it had been sifted through silver. I walked the grounds, past fountains and hedges so perfect they looked frozen in time. Yet no matter where I went, there was a sense that someone was always just out of sight. A door closing in the distance. The faint hum of a voice through the vents. A shadow that slipped around a corner before I could catch it. Alexander would return late most evenings. He would loosen his tie, pour himself a drink, and sit in silence beside me on the couch. He never explained his days. He never mentioned Isabella. I told myself not to bring it up yet. I needed to be sure of what it meant before I spoke. But the silence began to stretch between us like a thin sheet of ice. One wrong step, and it would shatter. One afternoon, while walking past his office, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Just enough for a sliver of light to spill into the hallway. I froze. Inside, his desk was bare except for a crystal glass and a neat stack of papers. A scent drifted out, faint but familiar. Not his mint, but something softer, floral. I stepped closer, my breath shallow. Before I could see more, Clara appeared at the end of the hallway carrying a tray. Her eyes flicked to the open door, then back to me. She shook her head once, slow, almost imperceptible. I stepped away, my heart pounding, and by the time I turned back, she had pushed the door shut. That night, as we sat in the dining room beneath the chandelier, I watched him. The way he cut his steak with slow, precise movements. The way his gaze avoided mine. The way his phone lit up beside his plate, the screen turned away from me. He excused himself to take the call. I heard his footsteps fading into the west corridor. Heard the click of his office door closing. I started to notice other things after that. The smell of perfume in the back of his car. The faint smear of lipstick on a crystal glass in the library, one morning when I knew I had been the only one there the day before. The way the staff exchanged small, knowing looks when his name was mentioned. Little details that, alone, could be dismissed. Together, they began to feel like a pattern. One rainy evening, I asked him if he would join me for breakfast the next morning. Just breakfast. Just us. He smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes, and said he would try. The next day, his coffee sat untouched again. His chair stayed empty. I poured my tea and sat there, staring out at the garden, watching the gardener bend over the roses in the rain. The cold walls of the mansion seemed to press in on me, as if the house itself wanted me to understand something it could not say out loud. And I wondered if this was what my life was going to be, a series of closed doors and silent corridors, waiting for someone who never really arrived. By the end of that week, I stopped walking past his office. Not because I no longer wanted to know what was inside, but because I was starting to fear what I might find if the door was ever open again. It began with little fractures in my days, the kind you almost miss until the light hits them just right. A canceled dinner here, a missed promise there. He would tell me he had to work late, that a deal was delicate, that he could not leave until it was sealed. At first, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. But each excuse sounded like the echo of the one before. One Thursday evening, I dressed in a new midnight blue dress, one I had chosen because he once told me I looked like the ocean in it. We had planned dinner at a quiet French place downtown. I waited in the sitting room, listening for his footsteps. The clock hands slid past 8, then 9. At 9:30, my phone lit up with his message. Sorry, can't make it. Meeting ran over. Don't wait up. I sat there in the silence until the warmth from the tea on the table faded. Then I changed out of the dress, folded it carefully back into its box, and told myself tomorrow would be different. But tomorrow was the same. And the day after that. When you love someone, you learn their rhythms. The way their voice shifts when they are tired. The sound of their shoes on the stairs. The pauses between their words. And slowly, I began to hear changes in his rhythm. His shoes didn't sound in the hall as often. His voice held a tightness, as if each word had been weighed before it left his mouth. And there were longer pauses. Too long. I began to keep a journal again. At first, it was a way to keep myself busy. But the pages soon became a place for the questions I could not ask him. Where do you go when you say you're working? Who calls you so late at night? And why do I feel like you're slipping further away each time you say my name? One rainy afternoon, I went into the library to read. The fire was already lit, the room warm. On the table beside my usual chair sat a single crystal glass. A trace of lipstick curved along the rim. Not mine. I touched the glass without meaning to, the chill of it settling into my fingertips. I stood there for a moment, staring at the mark like it might tell me its story if I waited long enough. When Clara came in to tend to the fire, her eyes flicked to the glass. She moved to clear it quickly, too quickly, as if she did not want me to notice. But I had noticed. And I knew she knew I had. Later that night, Alexander came home later than usual. I watched him from the couch as he walked in, loosened his tie, and poured himself a drink. He didn't notice the way I studied his face, the way I searched for a trace of something, guilt, maybe, or an explanation. All I found was the same careful calm he always wore. The more I looked, the more I saw. A whisper of perfume on his jacket, an unfamiliar key on his keyring, a text that lit up his phone, a name I didn't recognize before he turned the screen face down. All small things. All enough to keep me awake at night. One night, I woke to find his side of the bed empty. The clock read 2:13. I pulled on my robe and padded down the hall. The light under his office door was on. I stood there, listening. There was no sound, no movement. I almost knocked. Almost. Instead, I turned back, climbed into bed, and stared at the ceiling until the light under the door finally went out. By the time autumn began to burn the trees outside, I felt the first real crack in my own calm. The suspicion was no longer a whisper. It was a steady, quiet hum, the kind you could feel in your bones. And deep down, I knew that someone, was on the other side of that hum, waiting to be found. It happened on a night I had not planned to be anywhere near the city. Alexander had told me he would be gone late again, some client dinner that could not be moved. The rain had been falling all afternoon, restless against the tall windows, and I felt caged inside the mansion. On impulse, I called an old friend and decided to meet her for coffee near the river. I drove myself, something I rarely did anymore, and by the time I arrived the rain had slowed to a mist. The cafe's windows faced the street, and that was how I saw him. Not in the polished comfort of his black town car, but stepping out of a taxi in front of the Aurora Hotel. His suit was darker than the sky, his hair damp at the edges, his hand brushing over his watch like he was checking time he didn't want to spend. And beside him was a woman. She wore a red dress the color of ripe cherries, the fabric clinging to her in a way that made every movement feel deliberate. Her hair was pinned up with a few loose strands brushing her neck. I could see her smile as she spoke to him, and even from across the street, it felt intimate. Not careless, not friendly. Something older. Something that had been there long before I came along. They walked into the hotel together, his hand hovering at her back without quite touching it. But the space between them felt charged, as if every inch was a choice. My breath fogged the cafe window, my fingers gripping the edge of the table. I told myself to look away. Instead, I watched the glass doors close behind them. I barely heard my friend arrive. I barely tasted the coffee. My mind kept replaying the image, her red dress swaying as she walked, his gaze fixed on her in a way I had never seen fixed on me. By the time I left the cafe, my chest was tight with questions I could not yet ask. Driving home, I imagined a dozen explanations. Maybe she was a client. Maybe she was an old friend. Maybe the red dress was a coincidence and the hotel lobby was just a meeting place. But the truth is, I had already decided it was none of those things. Not in my heart. That night, he came home past midnight. I was awake, reading in bed, though the words on the page had blurred hours ago. He smelled faintly of perfume, something warm and sweet that had nothing to do with me. He kissed my forehead like he always did, a habit so consistent it felt rehearsed. I asked if the dinner went well. He said it was fine, nothing special, and turned away to change. Lying there in the dark, I tried to imagine the version of myself who could ignore this. The one who could let it fade like a bad dream. But instead, I saw the curve of her red dress as she disappeared through the hotel doors. I saw his shoulders relax beside her in a way they never seemed to with me. And for the first time, I felt something sharp settle in my chest. Not sadness. Not yet. Just the quiet, steady beginning of anger. The next morning, I pretended everything was normal. I asked about his day, about his meetings. He gave me answers that were polished and vague. But behind my nods and smiles, I made a decision. I would find out who she was. I would know her name, her story, and why my husband looked at her like she was a secret he wanted to keep forever. 2 days after I saw the woman in the red dress, Alexander told me he had an early meeting in the city and would be home late. His voice was even casual, the way someone speaks when they think they are telling you something unimportant. But I heard the space in his words, the pause before he said late, the way his eyes didn't quite meet mine. I decided not to wait for answers anymore. That evening, I took my car and drove toward the city, careful to leave long after he had gone. The streets were still slick from a late shower, the streetlights shining in the puddles like small trapped moons. I told myself I would only follow far enough to know where he went. Just to see. His car was easy to spot when I found it outside a quiet restaurant tucked into a corner of the old district. The kind of place with heavy curtains and candlelight. I parked far enough away to watch. And then I saw her again. The red dress was gone, replaced by a dark coat, her hair loose this time. She laughed as he held the door for her, the kind of laugh that made her tilt her head toward him like she'd been doing it for years. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the flicker of their silhouettes behind the window. They leaned in when they spoke. He touched her hand briefly, almost like an accident, but it wasn't. I could tell. There are touches you give without thinking and touches you give because you want to know how they feel. When they left, I followed them at a distance. The city was quieter now, the sidewalks nearly empty. They walked close, their shoulders brushing, speaking low enough that I couldn't hear through the rolled-down window. They stopped in front of the Aurora Hotel. I held my breath as they stepped inside. I didn't follow them in. I didn't need to. The image was already enough to burn into me. Back at the mansion, I waited in the library, the fire low, the room shadowed. It was nearly 1 a.m. when I heard his car pull up. He came in quietly, but his surprise was clear when he saw me awake. "You're still up," he said, loosening his tie. I nodded. "Where were you?" "A meeting." Then I stopped for a drink with an old friend. "Isabella." I said the name before I could stop myself. His head lifted slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to notice. "How do you know that name?" "It was on an envelope. Weeks ago. In the library. And I saw you tonight, Alexander." For a moment, the air between us was so still I could hear the fire crackle. Then he sighed, as if I'd asked him to carry something heavy. "She's an old friend," he said. "Someone I knew before I met you. She needed my help with personal matters." "Help that requires a hotel?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is." He didn't answer right away. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, part frustration, part something softer. Then he said, "I'm not having an affair. I swear to you." But his words didn't settle inside me. They floated there, weightless, without proof. And I realized it wasn't just the answer I needed, it was the truth he wasn't giving me. That night, we went to bed in silence. His arm was near mine, close enough to feel the warmth, but not enough to close the space between us. In the dark, I stared at the ceiling and wondered which was worse, that he might be lying to me, or that he might be telling the truth and I still couldn't trust him. After that night, something in me shifted. I stopped waiting for him to fill the empty spaces. I stopped checking the clock when he was late. I moved through the mansion like a guest in a place I had once thought I would own. And quietly, I began to build a life outside of its cold walls. It started with the charity art program I had put on hold after our wedding. I told Alexander the first wanted to restart it, and he simply nodded, distracted, his mind elsewhere. That was fine. I didn't need his permission. I threw myself into it, visiting the community center twice a week, bringing supplies, teaching children how to shape clay and mix colors until their hands were as bright as their smiles. It was there that I met Liam. He was setting up a small photography exhibit in the next room the first time we spoke. He had dark hair that fell into his eyes and a smile that arrived before his words. He asked if I could help him hang one of his larger prints, and by the time the frame was level, we were laughing about something I can't even remember. There was nothing heavy in that moment. No suspicion, no history. Just two strangers sharing a corner of a room. Over the next few weeks, we saw each other often. He would wander into my classroom during breaks, camera slung over his shoulder, and show me the portraits he'd taken that day. Sometimes he'd ask to photograph my students at work, capturing the blur of paintbrushes and the concentration on their small faces. There was an ease to him, a warmth that asked for nothing and gave without keeping score. One afternoon, after class, he offered me a ride home when my car wouldn't start. We drove with the windows down, the late autumn air crisp against our skin. He told me about the years he'd spent traveling, how every city had its own kind of light. When we reached the mansion gates, he looked at the house in silence for a moment before saying, "It's beautiful, but it doesn't look like it laughs much." I didn't know how to answer that. At home, Alexander noticed the shift. He asked more questions about my day, lingered at the breakfast table longer than usual, even suggested we go out for dinner one night. But it felt strange, like he was reading from a script he hadn't practiced in years. His attention came in sudden bursts, almost too bright, like sunlight after weeks of gray. I found myself caught between them. Alexander, who was finally trying, though I couldn't tell if it was out of love or fear of losing something. And Liam, who didn't need to try at all, yet still made me feel seen in a way I hadn't for months. One evening, I stayed late at the community center to help clean up after an event. Liam was there too, packing his camera gear. As we left, it began to rain. We ran for cover under the awning, breathless and laughing, and for a moment the rest of the world disappeared. He looked at me, rain clinging to his hair, and there was something in his eyes I didn't dare name. I went home that night with the sound of rain still in my ears and the warmth of that look lingering in my chest. Alexander was in the library, a glass of scotch in his hand, watching the fire. He glanced up when I entered, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw the same look in his eyes too, a look I hadn't seen in a long time. But the difference was, with him, I no longer knew if it was real. The days that followed felt like standing between two mirrors, my reflections stretching endlessly in opposite directions. On one side was Alexander, the man I had married, the life I had chosen. On the other was the possibility of something different, something warmer, something that didn't leave me guessing in the dark. Alexander's sudden attentiveness continued. He asked me to join him on short trips, lingered in the kitchen while I cooked, even told me small things about his day, details he had never shared before. I wanted to believe this was him trying, but the timing felt too perfect, as if my distance had pulled a string he hadn't realized was connected to me. One night, after dinner, he poured us each a glass of wine and sat across from me in the library. The firelight softened his face, made his eyes look less like glass and more like the sea before a storm. He told me about his childhood in fragments, his father's coldness, his mother's long absences, how he had learned early that emotions were liabilities. It was the most he had ever given me, and for a moment, I saw the man beneath all that frost. But it was only a moment, because even as he spoke, I thought of Liam. Of his laugh when he showed me a photograph he was proud of the way he listened without glancing at his watch, of the rain on his hair and the warmth in his eyes. The pull between them began to wear at me. I would come home from the community center with my chest light from an afternoon spent in easy company, only to feel the air in the mansion settle cold around me again. Even when Alexander was kind, there was always a space between us, a distance built from years before I ever met him, a distance I could never quite cross. One evening, after a charity event, Liam offered to walk me to my car. The night was clear, the city lights sharp against the dark. We stood beside my car, neither of us moving to open the door. He didn't touch me. He didn't have to. His presence was enough to make me feel something I hadn't in a long time. Safe, wanted, alive. He looked at me like he was on the edge of saying something, but he didn't. And I knew then that if he did, I might not be able to walk away. That night, lying beside Alexander in the dark, I stared at the ceiling and understood something with painful clarity. Love is not enough if it cannot be shared. And trust is not a seed that grows in silence. The decision came quietly, like the final drop in a glass already full. One morning, I packed a suitcase while Alexander was in his office. I left the wedding ring on the nightstand, its gold catching the thin morning light. I didn't leave a letter. There was nothing I could write that he didn't already know, deep down. As I closed the front door of the mansion for the last time, the cold air of the hallway gave way to the crisp morning outside. I walked to my car, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes, each step lighter than the last. I didn't know exactly where I was going, only that I was choosing myself this time. And as I drove away, the house disappeared behind the trees, taking with it the winter I had been living in. Sometimes, the real betrayal isn't in what they do. It's in what you let yourself endure.